At 2:17 in the morning, a police officer entered a forest chasing a man who was believed to be running from a crime scene. The officer thought he was following a desperate thief trying to escape with stolen property. He thought this would be another case that ended with an arrest, a report, and a quiet morning afterward. But what happened inside those trees became the kind of discovery that people in the town would talk about for years. The man running ahead of him was not just trying to get away. He was carrying a secret that had remained hidden for longer than anyone could imagine. And when the officer finally caught up to him, the stolen item was no longer the most important thing found that night. The forest was dark, isolated, and almost impossible to search. Every step deeper into the woods raised more questions. Why would someone choose this place as an escape route? What was he trying to protect? And what was waiting for the officer at the end of that trail? Because what started as a simple chase would soon become an investigation into a hidden truth that would shock an entire community. Before we continue with this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The officer had no idea that the decision to follow one suspect into the forest would lead him to a discovery that would completely change the way he looked at the case. The thief was running, the police were chasing, and everyone believed they already understood what was happening. But sometimes the first story people hear is not the full story. Sometimes the person being chased knows something that everyone else has missed. And on this night, hidden far away from the lights of the town, the truth was waiting to be found. The incident happened in a quiet rural community where life moved slowly, where neighbors recognized each other's cars, where people trusted familiar faces, and where serious crime was something most residents only saw on television. The town of Cedar Hollow had spent years believing it was the kind of place where nothing truly shocking could happen. Families grew up there, generations lived there, and people believed they understood the people around them. Doors were often left unlocked, children played outside until sunset, and strangers were noticed quickly. But on one cold night, that sense of safety disappeared when a police call came through that would eventually become one of the strangest investigations the community had ever witnessed. At the center of this story was Officer Daniel Carter, a respected police officer who had spent more than a decade protecting Cedar Hollow and the surrounding areas. Daniel was known among his colleagues as someone who paid attention to details others ignored. He was patient, careful, and believed that every piece of evidence had a story behind it. He was not the kind of officer who rushed to judgment. Before making a decision, he wanted facts, answers, and proof. Over the years, he had handled difficult situations, but nothing prepared him for the events that would unfold inside the forest outside town. For Daniel Carter, police work was more than just a job. He believed people deserved justice, and he believed that protecting a community meant understanding what was happening beneath the surface. That belief would become important later, because the man he chased into the forest was not exactly who everyone thought he was. The suspect was identified as Ethan Walker, a man who had recently become known in the area after being accused of stealing from a local property. To many people in Cedar Hollow, Ethan looked like the obvious person responsible. He appeared desperate. He was seen leaving the area quickly, and when police approached him, his decision was not to stop and explain himself. Instead, Ethan ran, and that single decision changed everything. At first, the situation seemed simple. A suspect had committed a crime, an officer was pursuing him, and the goal was to make an arrest. But as Daniel Carter followed Ethan deeper into the forest, something about the situation began to feel unusual. People who run from the police usually look for the easiest escape route. They move toward roads, buildings, crowded areas, anywhere that gives them a chance. But Ethan Walker ran toward the forest, a place where there were no witnesses, a place where there were no lights, a place that many locals avoided after dark. The question that kept coming back was simple. Why? Why would a man trying to escape choose the one place where he could become completely trapped? As investigators later discovered, Ethan Walker had a complicated history. His life before that night was filled with struggles and difficult choices. Some people described him as someone who had made mistakes and ended up in situations he could not control. Others believed there was more about his past that he had never revealed. But one thing was clear. Ethan knew something about that forest. Something that most people in Cedar Hollow did not know. For years, the forest had been considered nothing more than a large stretch of land outside the town. Hunters passed through during certain seasons, hikers occasionally explored its paths, and most residents ignored it completely. But rumors existed. Old stories about strange activity in the area. Stories about abandoned places hidden among the trees. Stories that most people dismissed because there was never any proof. Until that night. When Officer Daniel Carter entered the forest behind Ethan Walker, he believed he was chasing a thief. He believed he was closing in on a suspect who had made one bad decision after another. But with every step deeper into those woods, the situation became more confusing, because Ethan was not acting like someone who was simply trying to escape. He was acting like someone who was trying to reach something. Something hidden. Something important. Something he believed the police needed to find. And as the search continued, 3 questions began to take over the entire investigation. Why did Ethan Walker run into the forest? What was he trying to hide from the police? And what did Officer Daniel Carter discover inside those trees that turned a simple theft case into a mystery that would haunt Cedar Hollow for years? Before that night, Cedar Hollow was just another ordinary place. It was the kind of community where people waved at each other while passing by, where local shop owners knew their customers by name, and where families built their lives believing they were far away from the dangers that filled the headlines of bigger cities. The streets were quiet, the businesses closed early, and the biggest problems people talked about were usually small disagreements or everyday challenges. Nobody expected that one night would bring police lights, unanswered questions, and a mystery that would force everyone to look differently at the people and places they thought they understood. For years, the residents of Cedar Hollow believed they knew their neighbors. They knew who worked at the local stores, who walked their dogs in the mornings, and who spent weekends repairing their homes or taking care of their families. It was a place built on familiarity. A place where people believed secrets were difficult to keep because everyone knew everyone. But as investigators would later discover, knowing someone's name does not always mean knowing their entire story. And the story of Ethan Walker was far more complicated than anyone realized. Long before the night he ran into the forest, Ethan had been struggling to keep his life together. Those who knew him described him as someone who had gone through difficult years. His childhood was not easy, and as he got older, the challenges continued to follow him. Money problems, personal failures, and poor decisions slowly pushed him into situations that made people question his choices. Some people in Cedar Hollow saw Ethan as someone who had lost his way, someone who needed help, someone who had made mistakes but was not beyond saving. Others saw him differently. They believed Ethan had always been hiding something. The truth was that Ethan Walker had a side of his life that very few people understood. He kept to himself, avoided attention, and rarely talked about his past. When people asked questions, he often gave short answers or changed the subject. He was the kind of person who could spend years living near others without anyone truly knowing what was happening inside his mind. And that became one of the biggest mysteries surrounding him. Because after the night of the chase, investigators began looking deeper into Ethan's life and discovered something unusual. His connection to the forest was not new. In fact, Ethan Walker had been there before. Several times. Long before Officer Daniel Carter chased him into those trees, Ethan had been seen near the same area. Some locals remembered seeing him walking toward the forest alone. Others noticed that he seemed unusually interested in places most people avoided. At first, nobody thought much about it. Cedar Hollow had always had strange stories about the forest. People talked about old trails that disappeared into the trees. They talked about abandoned areas that had been forgotten over time. They talked about the feeling that something about the forest was different after sunset. Most people ignored those stories. But Ethan did not. And that was something Officer Daniel Carter would later focus on. Because Daniel had spent years investigating crimes, and he understood one important thing. People leave clues behind. Sometimes those clues are objects. Sometimes they are words. And sometimes they are the places they choose to return to. For Officer Daniel Carter, the chase after Ethan Walker was never just about catching someone accused of theft. Daniel had built his entire career around understanding situations before judging them. He had worked cases where the truth was buried under assumptions, where the first person blamed was not always the person responsible, and where the smallest detail changed everything. That night, when Ethan disappeared into the forest, Daniel remembered every lesson his years of service had taught him. Stay focused. Follow the evidence. Look deeper. Because something about Ethan's actions did not make sense. If Ethan Walker was only trying to escape punishment, why run toward a place where he could easily become trapped? If he was hiding something, what exactly was he hiding? And if the forest held the answers, why had he returned there again and again? As Daniel continued investigating, he began learning more about the area surrounding Cedar Hollow. The forest was larger than most people realized. Deep inside were forgotten paths, old structures, and locations that had not been visited in years. Places where memories disappeared and where evidence could remain untouched. The more Daniel learned, the more he realized that Ethan's connection to the forest was not random. There was a reason Ethan never explained, a reason he kept going back. And the people of Cedar Hollow were about to discover that the man they believed was running away from the truth may have been running toward it all along. But nobody knew why Ethan Walker kept returning to a place everyone else stayed away from. After the night of the chase, the investigation surrounding Ethan Walker changed completely. What started with a stolen item quickly became a mystery involving years of unanswered questions. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with a simple case. A suspect had been identified, a chase had taken place, and the goal was to understand why Ethan ran. But as Officer Daniel Carter and the investigation team began examining every detail, they realized the story was much larger than anyone expected. The first step was gathering evidence. Every piece mattered. The area where Ethan entered the forest was carefully examined. Investigators searched the ground, followed the path through the trees, and documented anything that appeared unusual. They collected forgotten objects, recorded locations, and reviewed every detail surrounding the night Ethan Walker disappeared into the darkness. Daniel Carter returned to the same forest path where the chase had started. But this time, he was not following footsteps. He was searching for answers. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions appeared. Why had Ethan been visiting this area? Why did he seem familiar with hidden paths inside the forest? And why did he react as if something much more important than his own freedom was at risk? Police interviews with people from Cedar Hollow revealed information that changed the direction of the case. Some residents remembered seeing Ethan near the forest weeks before the chase. Others mentioned unusual activity in the area that they had ignored at the time. Things that once seemed meaningless suddenly became important. A forgotten conversation. A strange visit. A location nobody paid attention to. Piece by piece, investigators began building a timeline. And that timeline led them to something unexpected. Deep inside the forest, away from the main trails, investigators discovered signs that someone had been using an area that most people believed was abandoned. The location showed evidence of activity that had been hidden for a long time. There were signs that something had been kept away from public attention, something that raised more questions than answers. At first, investigators did not know exactly what they had found. Was it connected to Ethan Walker? Was it connected to the theft? Or had they uncovered something completely separate? The forest that people once ignored suddenly became the center of the entire investigation. As the search continued, investigators uncovered clues that suggested the forest may have been connected to an older mystery. There were forgotten records, information that did not match previous reports, and details that made officials question whether this was the first time something unusual had happened in that area. For the first time, the possibility appeared that Ethan Walker may not have been the person investigators should have been watching. Because the biggest mistake investigators made was assuming the man running away was the only person with something to hide. As Daniel Carter reviewed everything, a different possibility began to appear. What if Ethan was not running from the truth? What if he was trying to reveal it? The investigation started looking at Ethan Walker from a different angle. Instead of only asking what crime he may have committed, they started asking what he knew. Was Ethan and what exactly was Ethan Walker trying to protect? As news of the investigation spread, Cedar Hollow was transformed. The quiet town that once believed it was untouched by serious crime suddenly found itself at the center of attention. Local news stations began covering the story. Reporters arrived asking questions. Residents gathered to discuss what they knew and what they had missed. People who had lived there for years started wondering if they had overlooked warning signs right in front of them. Neighbors who once believed they understood Ethan Walker began questioning their memories of him. Some believed he was guilty. Some believed he had uncovered something important. Others believed the truth was somewhere in between. But the investigation was far from over. Because just when Officer Daniel Carter and his team thought they understood what happened that night in the forest, new evidence appeared that changed everything. The evidence that came forward forced investigators to look at the entire case differently. For days, the people of Cedar Hollow had viewed Ethan Walker as the man who caused the chaos. He was the suspect. He was the person who ran. He was the person everyone believed had something to hide. But as Officer Daniel Carter continued reviewing the details, one thing became impossible to ignore. Ethan Walker had not been running into the forest to escape. He had been running there because he knew something was waiting. Something hidden. Something that had remained buried away from the community for years. The truth was that Ethan had discovered the existence of the secret inside the forest long before that night. He knew about the forgotten location, the hidden evidence, and the information that could completely change how people understood the area. He had been carrying that knowledge alone, unsure of who he could trust, and afraid of what might happen if he revealed it the wrong way. And that was the part nobody expected. The man everyone called a criminal had been carrying the truth for years. The stolen item that started the entire investigation was no longer the center of the story. It became only the beginning of a much deeper mystery. Investigators realized that Ethan's actions were connected to something much bigger than a simple theft. He had made mistakes. He had made choices that brought suspicion toward him. But the reason he ran into that forest was not because he wanted to disappear. It was because he believed the truth inside those trees needed to be found. Officer Daniel Carter spent years believing that every case had a hidden story behind it. But even he struggled with what this investigation revealed. The person he chased through the forest was not just a suspect. He was also someone who had information that could change everything. Daniel looked back at the events of that night differently. The moment Ethan turned and ran. The path he chose. The place he led police toward. At the time, it looked like the actions of a guilty man. But after learning the truth, those same actions told a completely different story. Ethan was not trying to leave the forest. He was trying to bring someone there. He wanted someone to see what he had found. Someone who would believe him. The discovery affected everyone in Cedar Hollow. The town that once believed it knew its own story suddenly realized there were parts of its history that had been forgotten. Families who had lived there for years began asking questions. People wondered what had happened before they arrived and how something so important could remain hidden for so long. Some residents felt betrayed. Others felt shocked. And some wondered if Ethan Walker had been judged too quickly. Because before the truth came out, everyone saw him through one image. A man running from the police. A suspect trying to avoid consequences.